Hello, everyone. My name is Luisa Palacios. I'm an adjunct senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I am delighted to welcome you to this webinar about project-based carbon markets and the policy landscape that is emerging globally. We have a fantastic panel with us. We want to welcome Ms. Ressa Kombi, Senior Climate Change Officer at the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Forestry in Kenya. Thiago Barral, Undersecretary for Implementation at the Secretariat of Carbon Markets, Ministry of Finance, Brazil, and Aparna Sharma, Program Lead of the Carbon Markets team at the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water in India. We also want to thank our partners at the Columbia Global Centers who have been instrumental in organizing this webinar. Thank you to the Mumbai, Nairobi, and Rio Global Centers. Before we move to a moderated discussion with our esteemed panelists, I am going to give the floor to my fantastic colleague, Gautam Jain, who has been the lead researcher in a year-long project in which CGEP is assessing regulatory approaches for project-based carbon credit markets in the world's main jurisdictions. And we want to share the lessons learned so far of how different countries are approaching questions about oversight, integrity, investor protection, scaling the market, etc. Gautam, with that in mind, over to you for this brief presentation before we move to a moderated panel discussion with our panelists.
Thank you, Luisa. Thank you to our panelists for joining this amazing session. Let me share my screen. Thank you to everybody for joining this morning. Let me see if I can share my screen and my presentation. Okay, so what I want to do today is just quickly talk about the current state of project-based carbon credit markets. I will talk about the role that regulations can play in this market, then briefly about the approach we are taking at CGEP to assess the current regulatory landscapes, especially across G20 countries and Singapore. We will share some of the preliminary findings from our research as well. So if you look at this chart on the right, essentially project-based carbon credit markets have continued to grow. This is data from World Bank, which shows a cumulative issuance of 2.5 billion tons of worth of carbon credits issued since 2018. The demand for these credits are coming both from voluntary carbon markets as well as from inclusion of credits in some compliance schemes, such as the one in California. Looking ahead, going forward, there should demand also be coming from Article 6, as well as rising demand from CORSIA. So now, while the total or the cumulative issuance seems to be going up, if you look at the issuance on an annual basis, it's actually been dropping and dropping quite steeply. From a peak of something like 500 million tons that was issued in 2021, in 2024, it dropped to 320 million tons, which is a drop of about 35%. And there wasn't just a drop of volume, there was also a drop in price. So overall, market value dropped. And you can see this on a year-on-year basis, going from 23 to 24, there was a drop in market value of about 30%. And this has happened even as compliance markets continue to grow and expand. They have expanded in terms of number of jurisdictions that now have compliance markets, are in the process of creating them. The revenues being collected in compliance market has gone up, trading volumes have gone up. So these markets continue to expand. So why is it that PCCMs are lagging? The big questions and concerns for this market basically circle around integrity, which includes baseline setting and additionality, permanence, double counting, transparency, and lack of standardization. More rigorous standards have been proposed in the last 2 or 3 years, primarily by ICVCM and VCMI, but these are voluntary and primarily non-binding. So this raises the question, is there an opportunity for regulations to make a difference here? We think yes, and that's why we are at CGEP pursuing this research. The reason we think this can make a difference is because national regulatory frameworks basically could provide enforceable safeguards to ensure environmental integrity, improve market trust, and support cross-border interoperability. And with that in mind, CGEP is basically conducting a stocktake of PCCM regulations across G20 countries and Singapore. And what we're doing in this research is we are dividing the regulatory landscapes into three main buckets. These are supply side regulations, demand side regulations, and market side regulations. Supply sides, basically regulations ensure that credits generated meet predefined quality standards, MRV regimes, and transparency rules. Demand side regulations define how credit may be used and reported by buyers. Finally, market side regulations provide rules for carbon credit trading, including eligibility, transactions, settlement, to ensure market transparency and integrity. As we proceed with our research to gather feedback from the relevant stakeholders, we organize two private roundtables, one in New York during the Climate Week and one in Brazil in the lead up to COP30. These were rich discussions, and we had stakeholders all the way from buyers to project developers to rating agencies and governments. So there are a lot of stakeholders involved. And what we've done is we've published the summaries of these discussions on the CGEP website for anyone who's interested. What I want to do today, though, is from the research that we've done so far, I want to share a few preliminary findings. First, more and more jurisdictions explicitly permit project-based carbon credits for compliance surrender, although with quality filters and some caps. And these caps are usually in single digits, so something like 5% can be made up of these carbon credits. And there are many examples of countries who've done this. These include Japan, China, Singapore, Mexico, and so on. Second, countries are moving from international registries to national registries with stricter MRV rules and disclosures. Basically, there's more of an effort towards data standardization that's going on. Third, article readiness varies quite a bit across jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions are incorporating into their regulations, and examples here include France and Japan, but there are others who are essentially just investigating ways to be compatible with it rather than incorporating them directly into the regulations. And the examples here are China and Canada, among others. Fourth, countries are establishing bilateral agreements to enable cross-border project-based carbon credit trading under Article 6.2. What this is doing is it's forcing these countries to have some uniformity across their framework because essentially they want to enable this cross-border trading under Article 6.2. Fifth, the legal status of carbon credits varies quite a bit by country. This is important because it shapes ownership, transferability, taxation, and oversight, all of which have key implications for interoperability across markets. Australia, for example, classifies carbon credits as personal property. Brazil designates it as a tradable asset. In the case of France, the legal status is yet to be defined. So it varies quite a bit across jurisdiction. And this is an issue that needs to be sorted out to make sure interoperability can happen across markets so that the market can scale up. Fifth, countries are developing supply-side regulations, and that's where progress has happened. But the governance models vary quite a bit across jurisdictions. Some, such as India, have a sole administrator with comprehensive authority covering both compliance and voluntary mechanisms. Others, such as Singapore, have different ministries overseeing the compliance and voluntary markets, but they work in a coordinated fashion. And yet others have separate ministries overseeing the markets with very distinct mandates. So the models can vary quite a bit across jurisdictions. Seventh, demand side rules are emerging, although they have been lagging quite a bit relative to supply side, but they are sort of gradually emerging. And as they emerge, there are quite a bit of divergences across jurisdictions here as well. Some jurisdictions legally require a sort of a mitigation first approach, in the sense that internal abatement takes precedence over offsetting. So you cannot offset until you have met internally scope 1, 2, and 3 targets. So essentially, it's a reduced first approach, and France is the one that has this in their regulations. And then there are other differences. So, for example, some have strict requirements for disclosures, such as UK, while others make corporate disclosures quite voluntary, for example, Japan. Finally, early policies focused primarily on the supply side of regulations, which deals with credit generation, as I mentioned earlier. But new regulations, as they're coming up, also incorporate demand side use and market infrastructure regulations, which is the right approach. In other words, there's a shift going on from just supply side regulations to essentially system-wide regulations. And examples of these system-wide regulations include Australia and Singapore. So these were some of our initial findings. We plan to publish a report going over these findings along with the stock take of G20 countries and Singapore in early April. This will be quite a detailed look into these countries. The idea would be to be able to analyze each regulations for each of these jurisdictions, but also compare and contrast them with each other. So please be on the lookout for this. As I mentioned, it should be published in early April. With that, let me give it back to you, Luisa.
Thank you, Gautam, for this fantastic overview. I think this sets the stage and helps our panelists with the context needed for our panel discussion. And so we have, as I mentioned, 3 phenomenal speakers, all coming from not only different countries, but different regions within the emerging market space. And what we wanted to do is, given the context that Gautam has presented, is maybe take a deeper dive and a deeper look into 3 examples of countries that have advanced in the emerging market space in the regulatory landscape for the project-based carbon markets. Before I start with the panel discussion, I just want to welcome the audience to feel free to start asking questions in the Q&A chat, so that because we're gonna take some of your questions in the third round of questions that we're gonna ask our panelists. Just for your purposes as well, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted at our website later in the week. So Thiago, let me start with you. Stepping back on Brazil's progress during its COP presidency, how do you see project-based carbon credits fitting into compliance carbon markets?
Well, thank you, Luisa. Thank you for the invitation, Gautam, as well. And greetings to my panel colleagues and the audience. It's really great to be part of this conversation. And because you mentioned COP30 and the recent leadership of Brazil in this context, I think it's interesting to recall that last year in Belém, Brazil led the launch of the Open Coalition for Compliance Carbon Markets. And we had, in this initiative, more than 20 countries gathered supporting, and also the EU. And the key point, the key goal of this coalition is to advance in harmonization and interoperability of carbon markets, particularly compliance carbon markets. We also had China joining, and we are now moving with governance and the work streams that will be developed under this coalition. But more specifically about Brazil's domestic context, after long discussions, we finally approved in Brazil's Congress, National Congress, in the end of 2024, its ETS law. And I would like to mention, first of all, that one of the dilemmas we had in the discussion before the approval of this law was how far should regulation go with regard to voluntary carbon market and more specifically project-based carbon credits. And I think we found a good balance to start with. And the most important points of regulation in this context, I think, is regarding safeguards to the rights of indigenous and traditional peoples when we have these projects, particularly in the Amazon and protected areas, but also some regulations regarding projects in state-owned areas and its relation to the jurisdiction programs. So I think at the end, regulation covered mainly these aspects. Now, more specifically on how the project-based carbon credits and the compliance carbon market will connect, it's important that the legal framework created two tradable assets under the compliance carbon market. One is the allowances, as normally ETS have, but also it created a specific tradable asset for the offsets that are derived from project of carbon credits. So a carbon credit, a project that is offering carbon credits in the voluntary market can participate in the compliance carbon market, but they have to comply with the accepted the methodologies that come to be accepted by the managing body of the compliance carbon market, and any additional integrity criteria. And for example, land property rights and other aspects that we are currently discussing can be introduced. Now, what we expect is that these methodologies and strict criteria in terms of credit integrity for accepting these credits will offer a label for some of these projects to be valued in the voluntary market as well, not only in the compliance carbon market. And finally, for international transfers, according to the Paris Agreement, these credits have to be, again, going through these accepted methodologies by the managing body. So again, this will add a layer of integrity, let's say, criteria that we hope will benefit the market by advancing the standards and creating additional integrity criteria. We are at a very early stage of implementation, so a lot of discussion still to take place. But these are I would say, the main aspects that help us understand how compliance and project-based carbon credits can interact in this new framework.
Thank you, Thiago. This is fascinating. Just you walking us through the policy and regulatory landscape and how all of those markets are interacting with each other, and how do you move from idea to implementation. So really, really fascinating what you're presenting. So Ressa, Kenya's story is not doesn't start with that framework that Thiago is mentioning, the interaction with compliance markets and voluntary markets. And so it would be interesting if you could walk us through the framework actually that Kenya is using to develop its carbon market.
Thank you, Luisa, and good morning or good evening to everybody joining this webinar. And thank you, Gautam, for setting the scene for this particular session. It indeed paints a picture of where Kenya is at. If I go way back during the Kyoto era and just the VCM markets, Kenya has been part of that since the early 2000s. So the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, the second and also along the transition by also participating in the voluntary carbon markets. And this essentially tells you that we've been in the supply side of the market. And picking from where Gautam has left, whereby it was really either you focus on supply side or demand side or market side, I'll say that we're indeed moving into the system-wide regulation of the entire market within the country. So Kenya's journey has been quite deliberate in constructing a homegrown sovereign carbon markets with clear executive declarations and intent, beginning with Kenya's return contribution of 2021-2030 on the country's utilization of the market mechanism and market approaches in meeting our NDC targets. And within that very intent, we do say that we will develop policy and regulatory framework to be able to participate in the markets. And based on that journey, definitely you have to take cognizance of the fact that there's been some lag time since we decided that we are moving markets to the Paris Agreement. So following from Glasgow all the way to Berlin, we've seen that countries have been shifting their frameworks to be Paris aligned per se. So we have moved from just treating markets as a side activity because we're just on the supply side, but now to a legally recognized climate economic instrument that is anchored by one, the Kenya's Climate Change Act that was first developed in 2016, but amended in 2023 deliberately to incorporate carbon markets. And within that, we all know that we cannot implement a law. We have to develop operational documents to be able to implement the provisions of the Act. This means that we've come up with regulations to implement the provisions of the Act on carbon markets. So basically laying that foundation for national sovereignty and to ensure that our market meets the highest international integrity standards as we transition to the Paris markets, while also remaining Paris aligned. First of all, in addition to those two regulatory instruments that are currently functioning, we are also developing the National Carbon Registry, basically the infrastructure of it. And in addition to that, finalizing the regulations that will govern the operation of the registry. We also know that rules on paper are not only the beginning. Therefore, there are specific gaps that you have to fill as you continue to implement. Therefore, we are looking at bridging the gap between the regulation implementation, and therefore, we've initiated a process of developing a rigorous readiness and needs assessment to allow us as Kenya to look inward and identify the exact technical and institutional gaps that we need to strengthen and to be truly Article 6 market ready. And I'll go back to Gautam's statement that we need to be system-wide regulated. And in addition to that, we are developing a strategic engagement guide on carbon markets that will be essentially, I'll call it an operational document, basically a step-by-step guide for decision-making. What we are looking at is where we are as developing countries is the expertise is very limited. And once one person who is technically sound in carbon markets, once they leave the office, it means they've left with all the knowledge. But now this document that we're developing right now, basically it helps anyone to make a decision whether you're technically sound in carbon markets or not. So it's going to be a strategic document for decision-making, ensuring that we engage with partners and investors from a position of strength and clarity as well. And that particular whole journey of that strategic engagement document, it's clearly providing a roadmap of what to follow. And this guide enhances awareness across all sectors and ensures that we prioritize projects that aligning strictly with the NDC and also the long-term development goals of the country. Finally, at the heart of this entire structure is a commitment to social safeguards. I remember a colleague from Brazil saying that there's need to ensure that we safeguard the rights of the communities, and that aligns with our legal structure as well. And our social safeguards include mandatory benefit sharing that must be shared with the local communities through what we call a community development agreement. So basically, we are working through the entire system that Gautam did mention to us, and it's deeming quite rigorous and needing all hands on deck, whereby we cannot only rely on environmental scientists or climate technocrats. You need everybody to chip in the expertise to be able to develop this whole legal framework and be able to implement it. Thank you. Over to you, Luisa.
Ressa, this is really fascinating. I love the idea that the starting point was from the supply side, but that you yourselves have found the need to develop a system-wide type of structure. I think it's fascinating from those countries that are looking at this also from the supply side, that you're linking this the framework onto your NDCs and the mentioning of Article 6. So it seems where you are in the market as well, regardless of where you start your journey, just understanding that there are commonalities in what Thiago was saying for Brazil, and then things that you are experiencing also in Kenya tells me that there are lessons that already can be applied in different jurisdictions, regardless of whether you're more on the demand side or on the supply side. Aparna, now would love for you to come in. India has had a long history with this kind of carbon markets mechanisms. Would be very interesting to see where it stands today, what's operational now, what's under development, and what should this international audience understand about the direction of travel of India in its carbon market journey.
Thank you, Luisa, for that question. And let me first take the opportunity to really thank the Columbia Center for Global Energy Policy for having me at this webinar. And I'm also glad to have international audience who can gain from this discussion. One point, Luisa, before I begin, and what Gautam also mentioned, there is a certain evolution that's happening in the Indian carbon markets. And when I say evolution, and you also mentioned that what has been the history of the project-based markets for India, we have largely been participating in the CDM back from the Kyoto Protocol area, where India was one of the largest suppliers of credits within the CDM mechanism. So back in 2006, when we saw the peak of the CDM, we had about more than 16% of CR issuance coming from India. So that period has really helped India build the technical capacity. There has been a surge of project developers. A lot of renewable projects have been developed in India starting from that point. And that also started the beginning of participation of various project activities for India within the voluntary carbon market mechanism. Now, where we are, it really is a transition point. And why I say so, that India has now diversified its approach in 3 varied project-based markets. So we have first the Article 6 mechanism, which is of the UNFCCC. India is now actively looking at increasing its participation within that mechanism of 6.2. And recently we had the JCM as part of the 6.2 being signed by India. So the opportunity there, of course, is for the other countries to meet their NDCs through the buying of those credits. But for India, largely the benefit is around to support the decarbonization and scale the green industry. Second is India also continues to participate a lot within the voluntary mechanisms, such as the VCS, where we have the gold standard, also a lot of removal activities within the agriculture sector, such as the biochar, enhanced rock weathering, are also picking up vastly in India. And we have significant offtake for those activities from corporations. And that's also a big market, I would say, where India is supplying those credit. And finally, the carbon credit trading scheme. So as Gautam mentioned, India has announced its own Indian carbon market, which has the compliance, CCTS, as shortly it is called, the compliance mechanism, which is akin to an ETS, and also its own voluntary mechanism, which allows for the offset-based credits. So what is the intersection between the two? As we see many ETSs today, more than 24 ETSs which are functioning allow for offset credits to be included, which is seen as a hard policy push for good quality credits to be allowed within the mandated ETS mechanism. Similar to that, India is also looking at a future inclusion of offsets, maybe to a percentage of 5 to 10, currently not part of the ETS, but there is expectation to be included as and when the targets become more stringent, because the mechanism has just started. So offset inclusion just becomes very difficult at the very beginning. But the opportunity for the non-obligated facilities there is huge within the CCTS offset mechanism. It allows for the corporations to also buy those credits currently, as the system is just picking up and holding momentum there. There are activities, methodologies within avoidance and reduction, but there's still scope to expand on the removal side of the things, because India is showing a lot of potential there within those activities. But CCTS, again, is the VCM mechanism is looking quite robust, since government is going to be giving its own regulatory oversight. It's looked at with more established MRV systems and diverse group of activities being allowed by the government. Besides the usual renewables, you're looking at certain agriculture-based soil sequestration activities, also some sort of high-end renewable technologies also being included there. So that's how the scope of the mechanism looks for India. So while I see that India will continue to be a significant supplier of the project-based credits, it's also transitioning towards creating its own regulatory government-led project-based markets. Yeah.
Thank you, Aparna. It's fascinating how the fact that India has had such a long history with carbon markets has, in a way, also determined how its evolution has ensued, and the fact that, as you mentioned, it was from the beginning an important supplier. So there's something to say about how that in and of itself has also informed how the rest of the market has evolved in India. So thank you for that context. I wanted now to ask the same question to all of you, because again, one of the things that we would like to do is just have you present to this audience kind of the challenges, the lessons that you have learned that could help others in their own journeys for establishing their own carbon markets and scaling their markets in a way that fulfills the integrity purpose, but really sets this as a successful venture going forward. So let me start with you, Thiago. What are the things that you have seen so far about either lessons, challenges, things that you think Brazil has gotten right that are also important lessons for others? And then we'll go over in the same order to the other two panelists. So let's start with you, Thiago.
Okay, well, thank you. I will briefly mention four challenges or aspects that I think are worth fit well into your question. First of all, I mentioned that project-based carbon credits can only participate in the compliance carbon market and for international transfers if they comply with the accepted methodologies that will be a decision of the managing body of the compliance carbon market. So this is the first challenge, how to define the criteria, which methodologies will accept. There's a lot of pressure to move fast with that. But so I think that will be that is already a challenge that we are facing, and I see there some space for policy decisions on what typology of projects we want to foster or incentivize, and with focus on the co-benefits, for example. So I see that as a challenge that we are facing right now, and we are already suffering a lot of pressure on how to move with that decision. Second, the legal framework that was approved in 2024 created a multi-billion demand for project-based credits by establishing that insurance companies and pension funds would have a mandatory share of their technical reserves allocated in carbon credits or related investments. However, and that would create an immense demand for a captive demand for project-based carbon credits, in fact, much beyond the capacity of supply in the medium term that we would have. Now, however, that is under discussion right now in the Supreme Court about the constitutionality of this article, and the verdict will be a relevant definition in the coming weeks and months. Third, ensuring respect to land property and rights is quite a challenge. Brazil is huge, particularly in the Amazon region. We still have a huge deficit in avoiding the use of public or state-owned areas by private developers, and also avoiding overlapping land property rights. So that is also a challenge that we have to face, and we are starting a work group for addressing that challenge. And finally, the need for fostering new certification and verification companies. And for example, the National Development Bank has announced a call to foster new certification companies to develop, and also there are some initiatives to advance in developing methodologies and standards that address regional and national distinct conditions that we have in this growing market. So I'll stop here. I think these are some of the challenges, but also opportunities that we have in the Brazilian case.
Luisa, do you want to go to Ressa next? Ressa, please go ahead. I think Luisa's computer froze. Please.
Sure. Like India and China, who are really big during the CDM era, by that I mean the biggest supplier of CRs within the not the region, the world. We were, or we still are, big in the continent, but we didn't have that much experience in terms of technical capacity to carry over to this new era. And I'll say over the few years we've been through this journey, I'll say our journey has been masterclass in learning by doing. We all say nowadays with this Article 6 markets, basically learning by doing. But while we have built a robust legal framework, doing all this readiness and needs assessment, pointing out a number of primary hurdles that we need to address to reach our full operational potential within the markets, we still see that our journey has revealed setting up a sovereign carbon market is not merely a technical exercise, whereby, as I mentioned before, where you deal with technocrats only. It's not that. It's not science. It's beyond that. It is a high stakes investment and a legal undertaking that requires a vast range of experts involved. And therefore, our most pressing and immediate challenge is the inadequate capacity in both technical and non-technical across all the levels of governance. We are only a handful, and therefore being pressed by addressing issues both left, right, and center. And we have learned that we need all hands on deck, legal experts, financial analysts to lead, even to local administrators, because remember that we are also dealing with communities in this particular aspect. So we need everybody from the presidency all the way to the villages to be able to be involved in this transition of setting up markets that is ready to perform to its optimal levels. So with this discovery or realization of the profound implications if we don't have systems set in place, therefore, we must bridge the gap between the technical officers and other sectors as well. Without a systematic program to build awareness and institutionalizing the multidisciplinary knowledge from the national to the subnational, we will indeed remain vulnerable to an array of risks that technical expertise alone cannot handle. I'm imagining a scenario where there's a court case and the only people who know about it is the technical people. How do you go about it? Even your legal or the Office of Justice within the country is not aware of what's going on, do not understand what carbon market is. That realization that, wait, we need a comprehensive capacity building program that is really targeted to every cadre of the population and also disciplines across the sector is very key and very urgent. And therefore, what we are doing is within the legal framework. Yes, the legal framework can go as far as just mentioning what we need to do, but we are trying to unpack what a certain mandate or particular mandates really mean and try to create individual programs around those mandates so that we comprehensively capture what we intended to do, especially as the Minister of Environment, and also supporting the Signatory National Authority to perform its mandate to the optimal. What I'll focus on much is that technical capacity and non-technical capacity to handle the entire market ecosystem. And a colleague from Brazil did mention about methodologies, and I remember that, you know, with this aspect of methodologies and baseline setting and additionality, we need technical rigor. And within the continent, we are struggling with that as well, whereby we need expertise or experts to understand the rigor that's needed in analyzing or deciding what methodologies we need to accept at this particular time. We are also looking at the time remaining to implement the NDCs until 2030, while also coming into bilateral agreements and setting up the methodologies within the particular agreement to be able to be used by projects. But your eyes can only see as far as they can, but you don't know whether you're accepting the right one or the wrong one. So we are also in the same conundrum whereby, do we choose this or that, and or for what benefit is it to the country? And I believe even the NFCCC and the supervisory body could be facing the same challenge over which one should you prioritize? Is it really serving the market or not? So yeah, leave at that. Over to you, Gautam.
Ressa, incredible, because I think what I'm hearing from you and from Thiago, and we're going to listen to Aparna in a second, is issues about interoperability, the co-benefit, the aspect of it, the methodology, what kind of methodology, and are they fixed in time? Do they have to evolve as technology evolves? So there are a lot of things that I think as policymakers you have to weigh in, including the social benefits and the multidisciplinary aspect and technological and technical capacity that will require to handle these markets as they scale. So very interesting what you both are saying. Aparna, over to you.
Thank you, Luisa. And I cannot agree more with Thiago and Ressa, the points that they have made. And a lot of those also apply for India, I must say. And given that, I wouldn't repeat a lot of those points and stick to some specific ones that apply for India. Within the VCM mechanism, we have seen that there's not a lot of diversity of project portfolio for India. So that's number one for us, that they're heavily concentrated within one sector, and that's probably renewable. Of course, now the project-based markets are moving away from the renewable sector and is diversifying more towards transport, waste, renewable removal technologies. So that's where I feel that the scope is for India. The larger concentration it remains, it becomes very difficult to really have good quality credits out of renewable energy project. Second is very recently at CEEW, we did a study assessing on the challenges within the VCM mechanism. And what we found out, especially for the AFOLU sector, the agriculture, forestry, and land use in India, what rest of the Asia would take about 400 days to get their projects registered. And for India, it was more than 1,600. So it's like double, four times the time that is taken for rest of the Asia. So that is a difficult situation. And when we went more depth into what are the reasons around it, that we have issues around land ownership, regulatory issues within the AFOLU sector altogether. So I think for India, especially, the elephant in the room is to address problems related to additionality, permanence, and the longer time period that AFOLU projects take. Also, one of the points that Thiago mentioned around the accreditation of the verifiers, and that's also one of the very important points for India, especially if you're looking at building more integrity within your domestic VCM mechanism that's going to be run by the government. You need to have more verifiers. And currently the challenge is how to scale that, how to have international level accreditation boards that would give accreditation to those validation agencies. And that scaling is something where we see a lot of international cooperation can also build into. Finally, on the methodologies, and that's very relevant, a lot of time, the challenge has also been with the Indian situation. The methodologies are not tailored to the Indian approaches. What we need definitely is that a greater cooperation to see how these methodologies can work for the Indian condition. And this especially happens for projects within the agriculture and such sectors, especially while we see, and as I already mentioned, biochar is significantly picking up, but you would see the pockets very specific to certain zones in India. So it would be Western India where these projects are coming up, because the methodologies would not be so relevant when it would come to the northern side of the India. So we have to really look into how to scale and build the scientific element of those methodologies, especially in the projects where there's high capability of getting better credits. And finally, on the MRV, and that's one significant point, whether it is a government-run VCM mechanism or you have the private player, the MRV plays the most important role. And that has to be strengthened. Only if that happens, and the problems is that the registries or those standards are not working with the project developers in India to having them scaled in building those MRV standards. So I think those are the clear points from the India context. And I, of course, echo the points also being raised by Ressa and Thiago. And will not be repeating in the context then. Over to
Thank
you,
you.
Luisa.
Thank you, Aparna. This is great. Just comparing India, the similarities of the issues with the rest, and adding the specificities in relation to India, I think is pretty much what we were looking for. Let me turn it over now to the Q&A that we have from the audience, and let me start with you, Thiago. One from Isabel Zeta, a Brazilian journalist from Agência Pública. She has two questions. Let me just ask you one for the sake of time. She's mentioning that some experts worry that allowing project-based credits into the regulated compliance market could affect the price of assets in that market, since project credits, which are defined in the voluntary market, tend to be cheaper. How can regulation reduce this risk?
Well, thank you, Isabel, for the question. And I did not mention in my previous answer, but it's up to the managing body to develop a study to define to which extent these offsets will be accepted in the compliance carbon market. So it's not that every amount of project-based carbon credits will be accepted as offsets, but there will be a limit. And the discussion whether it's 5 or 10 or 20%, depending on each sector, regulated sector, is a decision that is yet to be made. So this regulatory impact is at the beginning, and of course we know that we can expect different prices for different types of carbon project-based carbon credits. And how they will be accepted as offsets is not covered by is not limited by the methodologies that will be accepted, but also to the cap that will be defined for accepting these offsets. So that is the two main, let's say, regulatory tools that we have to ensure that these offsets are not, let's say, affecting the efficiency of the decarbonization of the targeted sectors, for example, industry, in the regulated or the compliance carbon market. So I hope it covers the question.
Thank you, Thiago. I know that Gautam has a question that he wants to ask. Over to you, Gautam.
Sure. Actually, if I could just quickly follow up on Thiago's answer to this question to Isabel, and I would not speak necessarily in the context of Brazil, but just globally, because that's what we are analyzing. What I would say is a lower price is not necessarily the right thing, in the sense that part of the issue in this market that we are facing is that demand for credits is going down. And demand is going down because of integrity issues. And integrity issues typically lead, they're coming up because there are a lot of low quality credits that are, flooding the market. And because these are low quality credits, they tend to be lower in price. So lower price is not necessarily the aim or the right thing to do. If anything, what compliance market can do, which is the approach Brazil is taking and many other countries are taking, is they will set a minimum standard that these credits will have to meet, which will improve the integrity. With that, probably it'll increase the price. And increasing price can also help, good projects to take off. If the price is too low, many projects don't take off because they know there's a certain minimum cost that they face. So I'm not necessarily sure this argument that prices will go up is a bad thing flies here. And I'm speaking more generally, not necessarily in the context of Brazil itself. There's another question actually in the chat, which I'll quickly address before I go to Ressa and Aparna. The first question, which is talking about CCUS, where does that fit in project-based carbon credits? Love to hear, Aparna or Ressa, if you have anything on it. But from our study, what we've seen is the way these regulations work. Many countries have a list of eligible activities that they list out. So some of these countries have listed out very categorically what is allowed and what is not allowed. So in the case of CCUS, Australia and Canada, for example, have included those in their regulations. So those are countries that allow them. Not every country allows them, and not every country has listed the activities. But just to give you an idea that they can fit in with regulations, again, they have to meet certain minimum standards, and certain minimum criteria to qualify, but they are there in the case of some countries. I don't know if Aparna or Ressa or Thiago, if you have anything to add on that, please go ahead. Otherwise, I can ask. I have a question for both Ressa and Aparna that I want to ask. Okay, maybe I'll go. Aparna, go ahead.
I just had one quick liner there. So India does allow for CCUS as part of its Article 6 stated activities. So India has about 13 activities that it has identified, and most of those activities are high-end renewables with storage, green hydrogen, green ammonia. And within removals, so CCUS is included, which is also sometimes much debated that whether, because it not being durable, whether it should really be accounted as removal. But for India, it is part of that activity list. Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. So maybe I'll quickly follow up. CCTS is supposed to be start implementing this year, but details are still missing, especially when it comes to what you were talking about, the limit. What is how much of carbon credits will be allowed? What exactly will be the process? How what is the timeline? How do you see this playing out?
That's a tricky question, Gautam,
Sorry.
because maybe as a researcher, just giving a background, CCTS compliance, the ETS of India is in its first year. And we follow the financial cycle. So this year would end March 2026. So post which we would see how this first cycle performed and where we had mostly the hard to abate sector as part of this. There was an analysis that CEEW came out with looking at how the targets were, and as was expected, they're more or less around the achievable side of the MAC. So it is the inclusion of offsets, largely how we interpret from the carbon market ETS perspective should depend on the stringency of the target. So if already the targets are achievable, there is lesser argument to include offsets within those. And that's how we have also seen for the EU ETS or many of those ETSs that have included. There's certain trajectory to how stringent the targets will be. For India, we are expecting maybe in a short to medium timeline of 3 to 5 years is when that should be included. And that to a limited percentage. Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you. I know I was putting you on the spot, but it's still good to get a sense of that. Ressa, if I could go to you, essentially there are, in the case of Brazil, India, they're going to introduce ETS. There's some countries that are opting to introduce ETS, especially in the context of CBAM. CBAM, essentially countries now want to have a domestic carbon price, but Kenya is not on that path. So, maybe you can tell us a little bit of the trade-offs that you thought of or thinking of in terms of introducing. Maybe it can help other countries who are sort of thinking along the same lines. So please, Ressa.
And sorry to interrupt, but it's in 1 minute that you have to answer Gautam's very complex questions.
Yes.
Thank you, Gautam. As I mentioned before, we are essentially within, basically largely within the voluntary markets, and within the compliance side is just the UNFCCC markets. When it comes to either carbon tax, ETS, it has been a conversation since we started the legal framework in 2023, but after the analysis, we determined that it's not the right time to introduce an ETS or carbon tax within the country, whether it's upstream or downstream in any sector. Why? Actually, the thing started by being trained on how to publish a carbon tax ETS within the government, just knowing which points to target in case we need to establish that. And coming now into the policy, we use that knowledge to make an analysis or come up with an analysis of how the pros and cons of establishing that within our context. And looking at the economy, the sectors driving the GDP of the country, we see that it's not an appropriate time to introduce an ETS right now, one tax for the moment, given that the key sectors that will potentially be part of an ETS really contribute to the GDP. And if you put limitations to them, then it will the economy. Maybe in the near future, once we pick our emissions, if we do pick our emissions. What to you?
What do you,
Thank you.
Lisa?
No, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thiago, Ressa, Aparna, Gautam. This has been a fascinating discussion. I think we achieved our goal of just presenting a landscape of where the regulatory frameworks are in many countries and a deep dive on 3 specific countries which are really relevant for carbon markets in emerging markets. So I really thank the 4 of you, and specifically Ressa, Thiago, and Aparna, for joining us, for sharing your experience, and for being this generous with your time and your expertise. To all the audience this will be probably listed by the webinar will be posted on our website by the end of the week, we believe. But any feedback that you have, any comments or questions, please feel free to either contact Gautam or myself. We are more than happy to have you join in this questions and research that we're doing. Good night, or good evening, or good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us wherever you are. Goodbye.